When I started my journey to the ministry in 2009, I knew it was going to be a long one. I needed to work while I went through seminary, so I had to go part-time, and I knew it was going to take 6 or 7 years, as opposed to 3. But after that, I figured I would do my internship, get ordained, and, on to the ministry. But here I am, still doing my day job, and with no plans to go into full-time ministry anytime soon. I knew that was the case by the time I actually did my internship here, when I started it in 2015. That summer, my father was diagnosed with dementia, and Karen's father had dementia. And both of them at that point were still in pretty good shape, but I knew that we're going to need money to basically fly back and forth across the states multiple times. I knew that, and so I just kind of kept working. I knew that, I understood the necessity, but that doesn't mean I was reconciled to it. It was like my journey had kind of hit a dead end. I really felt stuck, and I kind of felt bitter about it, because I started seeing some of my classmates at seminary get ordained and saw them get churches. And for a while that was hard. But then at one point, I came across a quote that kind of changed my way of thinking. And I know I've shared this quote before, I don't remember when, so it was 2018. And I was reading an article about the singer Joe Henry, who's someone I've listened to for a long time. And actually, my sister just saw him in concert last night. I'm so envious. But anyway, 2018, Joe Henry at the time had been diagnosed with cancer, and not just with cancer, but an advanced cancer. And, so he was in a pretty bad place. In an interview with LA Times, he said that, he initially saw the cancer as this big stumbling block, as this big obstacle on his journey. But then he realized that that really wasn't the case. He said, "This is not an obstacle to my journey. This is my journey. This is not an obstacle to the journey. This is the journey." I found that very freeing. I realized in my case, I had not been called to a particular destination. I had been called to a journey. I undertook this journey with a destination in mind, full-time ministry, and that's still my goal. But my task right now is to simply walk the path that I'm on and see where it leads me. I think we all have a tendency to kind of buy into our own idea of how things should work out. And to an extent, this is natural. It's even healthy. We like to have goals. That's what gets us up in the morning. That's what makes it possible to go through years of school. That's what makes it possible to put up with jobs we don't like, to endure hard times. We can put up with that stuff when we see it as kind of part of, helping us get to where we want to go, when we feel that sense of purpose. The problem is that we often take that sense of purpose and we sort of turn it into a set of expectations of how we think things should work out. It's one thing to say, here is my vision and here is my plan for achieving that vision. What gets us into trouble is when we see that plan as a script for our lives. And the problem is the universe doesn't follow our script. The universe doesn't follow our script. John Lennon saying it, life is what happens when you're busy making other plans. Now, I will say some people are lucky. They seem to lead charmed lives. In seminary, there were several students I know who they just sailed through seminary. They got ordained. They went into full-time ministry, and off they went. And yeah, that's good. But that's not guaranteed. When I think about people I've known for, say, 20 years or 30 years, I realize how often plans go awry, how often things go wrong. Health problems, broken relationships, financial problems, so many things that are unexpected. However much we may wish otherwise, there's so much that can and will go wrong. Now, when we think about it, it can be disorienting or even discouraging. The Buddhist teacher Pema Chodron describes this as a feeling of groundlessness, like getting the carpet pulled out from under your feet. And often we experience this groundlessness when something catches us off guard, such as a health scare or the loss of a job. Because in that moment, we realize how fragile things are. How fragile things are. But groundlessness is not the same as hopelessness or helplessness. Just because we can't always control how things work out doesn't mean that we have to surrender our sense of purpose, that we have to surrender our agency. In recent years, I've actually found comfort in kind of a strange place, in a field called process theology. And I'll have you know, I always swore I would never preach a sermon on process theology. But things happen. Here we are. Okay, so I said I'd never preach a sermon on this because it's kind of esoteric. I mean, it is truly esoteric. But let me see if I can explain. The basic premise of process theology is that the universe is always in a state of flux. Life does not follow a fixed path, but is constantly unfolding in new and unexpected ways. In other words, the universe doesn't follow a script, not ours and not even God's. According to process theology, even God is part of this process, always changing as the universe unfolds. But here's where hope comes into it. Process theology calls for us to take part in that unfolding. Every time the unexpected happens, we have an opportunity to respond in new and creative ways. The words for our chalice lighting were from Bruce Epperly, and he's actually a process theologian who lives in the area. He said, we are all on an adventure, the adventure of the day, the adventure of the season of life, never fully knowing the next step, but living with hope for insight, inspiration, intuition, and grace and courage for the path ahead. Now, when I first read this passage, I had to laugh, because when I was growing up and things went wrong, my father would often say, well, this will be an adventure. So let's say we're on a family hike and we get caught in a thunderstorm. Hey, it's an adventure. Or one year I was in Chicago, airport got caught in the air traffic controller strike. What an adventure. And actually over the years I have found unexpected power in this phrase. When things go sideways, it's easy to kind of get stuck, get stopped in our tracks, to get that feeling of stuckness. And for me, I found that seeing things as an adventure kind of keeps me lighter on my feet. Rather than stopping in our tracks, we can ask ourselves, okay, now what? What's our next step? But I also want to acknowledge that this adventure language is, not always right. There's some things that it just sounds too flippant to describe as an adventure, and I get that. But that idea of saying, now what? That's the critical piece. When we ask now what we mean is this: given the reality of the current situation, how can we respond in a way that keeps us moving? Even if it means we're moving in an unexpected direction. We can even put it in starker terms. When we find ourselves in a dark place, how can we move toward the light? In a way, that's how I dealt with my father's dementia. As he grew worse with each stage, I would ask myself, now what? How can I connect with him now? How can I support him? How can I support my mom? Now what? I remember the first time that I visited when he didn't know who I was. It's like, well, that was a change. Now what? Right? To say, now what, is to see that the obstacle is part of the journey. To say, now what, invites us to find the most creative, life-affirming response possible. That doesn't mean that we have to have an easy choice. It doesn't mean there's an easy answer. But how can we take a step toward the light? Creativity is a big part of it. The writer Susan Jeffers says, creativity is a huge part of uncertainty. If we were certain, then how could we allow ourselves the space to create, to grow, to imagine, to expand? We can't. Good thing there is really no such thing as certainty. Once we can accept that, we are giving ourselves permission to live in the uncertainty of creativity. Let it be a dance. Let it be a dance. And this actually has been my experience with ministry. After I got ordained, I stopped worrying so much about the destination, and instead I just focused on making the most of the journey, being ready to offer my ministry wherever it was needed. I was able to anoint my father just days before he died. When a close family friend got married, I did the wedding. When Karen's mother died, I officiated at her service. And of course, when Reverend Aileen had to leave, I've offered my ministry here. It's been a beautiful journey, wherever it's taken me. And I've been thinking about the journey this community has been on as well. I know it hasn't been easy. You've dealt with a lot of unexpected and difficult changes. And I know that shifting to a part-time ministry in particular has been challenging. But look at you. You've responded in such life-affirming and creative ways. You've found a new minister, someone you know and love. You're doing beautiful lay-led services in which you share your gifts with one another. You find countless ways to have fun together and to care for one another. It truly is a ministry of the people, for the people. And as I've said before, I am honored to share this ministry with you. And I can't wait to see where your adventure takes you next. Amen.